It is no surprise that the conservative movement, like the libertarian movement, is stretched, is fractured, is struggling to find some common language and points of agreement. There is a new statement out by a large contingency of conservatives, generally more towards the classical liberal side, and I would almost say libertarian side, that have put together a statement of principles known as the Freedom Conservatism Statement of Principles. My guest, Parker McCumber, and I walk through this statement and talk a little bit about it. Parker has been on before. He is a classical liberal and somebody that has thought deeply about these principles, and you'll hear why. And we'll take you through all 10 of the principles. We'll see what you agree with. Let us know if you agree or disagree over at chrisspangle.com on the comments for this podcast, and let us know what you think. I agreed with almost all of them. I think some of them didn't go far enough, and I don't know how much we can agree on issues of things like foreign policy, but I think it's important to at least find the points of agreement so we can start working towards some civil path as opposed to civil war. Let's take a look at the Freedom Conservatism Statement of Principles right after these words on The Chris Spangle Show. We run on the value for value model here on The Chris Spangle Show and the We Are Libertarians Podcast Network. That means, do you get value out of the show? Do you learn something that helps you sound smarter when talking with your friends? Do you feel a little bit more connected to the world and inspired to do something a little bit differently? Well, then please give some value back. And the best way that you can do that is through our Patreon. You can go to supportcss.com or patreon.com/wearelibertarians, and you can join our Patreon. Not only do you support the program and the entire We Are Libertarians podcast network by helping pay all of the bills, you're also going to get ad-free shows. You're going to get early releases, sometimes months in advance in terms of episodes that haven't been released in the public feed yet. You'll also be able to get the full archives, the full RSS feed of all the past episodes. And there's even a tier that you can come on the show, or you can have your name mentioned every episode like I am about to do right now. Thank you so much to our $100 a month members, especially Vincent Pikehole, Matthew Durbin, Jason Doolittle, Christy Avery, and our good friend Reinhold. Thank you so much for supporting us, and we appreciate everybody that considers making a contribution today. Parker, thanks so much for coming back on the Chris Spangle Show.
Thanks so much for having me, Chris. Pleasure to be with you.
Yeah, I'm blanking on what did you come back and discuss last time? Do you remember?
It was gun control.
Gun control, that's right, yeah.
After Washington had signed their bills into effect to institute waiting periods for AR-15 purchases.
Yeah, so go check that episode out. So if you didn't listen to that one, Parker is an entrepreneur, U.S. Army veteran, and contributor for Young Voices who specializes in economics, international affairs, and firearms policy. You can follow him at Parker_McCumber on Twitter. I will not call it X. I don't care what you've got in your bio.
It just sounds wrong.
I just refuse. So you're here today to talk about where conservatism is heading. So let's get our priors out of the way. I'm a former Republican turned Libertarian Party turned politically homeless guy in terms of my politics. And I'm libertarian, but I definitely am probably more in the classical liberal, constitutional, Republican, small R camp. So that's where I'm coming from. So when I read the Freedom Statement of Principles from Freedom Conservatism that you're here to talk about today, I agree with a lot of it. I imagine you do too if you're here to promote it. So where do you think you fall generally on the spectrum?
Chris, you could have just cut out what you said and just applied it to me. Formerly identified as a Republican, now a Libertarian. I definitely lean classical liberal and that base foundation of conservatism.
All right. I think we can both agree that conservatism and really libertarianism as a movement is in crisis. I think it's a little bit, libertarianism is generally more grounded thanks to the non-aggression principle. Mm-hmm. But conservatism over time, a Robert Taft conservative in the 40s is different than a Whittaker Chambers conservative, is different than a William F. Buckley conservative, it's different than a Reagan conservative, it's different than whatever the hell Josh Hawley is. So there's a little bit more of a sliding scale, I think, in conservatism. Generally, for those who don't know what conservatism is, it's meant to conserve the natural rights tradition. A conservative is supposed to be a person that wants to preserve the Declaration of Independence principles and the principles of the Constitution and natural rights, and that's broken apart in the Trump era. That's how I view the crisis, is that they've unmoored and moved more towards populism. How do you read the crisis in conservatism, if you think there is one?
I actually wrote an opinion on this, and I think part of the bigger picture of the crisis, when most people hear the word conservative, they think GOP. And you look even today, Speaker McCarthy getting voted out.
Yeah.
If you think conservatives as Republicans, that party is in shambles. They have no foundation of leadership at the moment.
It's really odd when there's a large contingent of the Republican Party that thinks that Robert Kennedy Jr. would be a better representative than Mike McCarthy. I'm not saying McCarthy's not a spineless weasel, but he's a lot more like conservative than Robert Kennedy Jr. I would call that the identity crisis, is that there's no consistency in terms of principles within the modern Republican Party or conservatism.
Definitely. And if you look at that across the party, look at the presidential race with the different factions, and many of them have just these followers that are so almost like a cult, where they're locked in on their nominee and who they're going to support, and they're willing to fight other conservatives to the death. It just seems a little bit wild to me, the different factions that you have. And I think a lot of those factions stems from the evolution of differing beliefs on differing subjects. And the Freedom Conservatism Statement of Principles really realigns, I think, what conservative values are fundamentally, what they should be fundamentally. And it's really refreshing to me to read that and say, yes, this is what I view conservative beliefs to be. This is what my take on this is. And so I view it as something that represents myself, and that many other conservatives would also fall in line with and say, yes, this is where our party should be headed. This is where our political beliefs align. And it's just frustrating to me that the higher levels of differing conservative leaderships in differing maybe parties or caucuses don't align with this.
Yeah, so before we dive into the principles and about the Freedom Conservative Statement, do you think sometimes in diagnosing the problem here that we confuse principles with, I look at, like, within the libertarian movement, there's a lot of people where I do agree with a lot of what they say. I just don't like how they say it. So it's the style as opposed to the substance. Do you think that we're not very clear on the right in articulating where we disagree in terms of principles and where we disagree in terms of practice?
I definitely think that's a cause to the problem here, and why there's so much factionism and differences in opinion. Definitely, we need to be better about talking about what the actual issues are and how we're going to address them. I think there's big divergences in both of those.
Yeah, so if you go back and look at the John Birch Society in the 50s and you read their blue book, which I have a copy laying around here somewhere, it really reads like a lot of the MAGA movement. And you had a lot of the same strands. You had the more, government-friendly statist Eisenhower Republicans. You had more Reagan conservatives. You had a bunch of different strands in the 50s and even into the 60s that could never come together. And the uniting force was something called the Sharon Statement, and really William F. Buckley. So can you talk about that statement in which the Freedom Conservative principles are based on?
Yes, so I believe that was authored in the early 1960s or 1960.
September 11th, 1960. Yep.
There we go. And essentially it was that basis when somebody thinks about conservatism and they think about the individual liberty, the smaller federal governments, they think about free economic policies. That's where this is, I think, really stemming from, in my opinion. That statement essentially laid the groundwork for the modern view of conservatism.
Yeah, so the Sharon Statement, founded in Sharon, Connecticut, at William F. Buckley's house, it had 12 clauses. First was, the foremost among the transcendent values is the individual's use of his God-given free will, whence derives his right to be free from the restrictions of arbitrary force. William F. Buckley and all the eggheads were writing this. The new statement's a little bit more clear, but basically the purpose, it seemed like, was to give a standard. So look, if you broadly agree with these principles, then we're in concert and we can support each other and we'll work together, and helped shape the Reagan Revolution. Now, fast forward to today, who is behind the founding of Freedom Conservatism, a statement of principles?
So Freedom Conservatism or the statement of principles has, I think now they're in the hundreds of signers who have backed this. And it ranges from people like Richard Armey, who was a former U.S. House Majority Leader, to some names that I know are on the list as Drew Bond, the Conservative Coalition for Climate Solutions. So this kind of stems across different educational institutions and political policy institutions, people who are in public foundations and people who are in private organizations. So this kind of is spanning a full range spectrum of conservatives. I think Jeb Bush is on there.
Mm-hmm. But then you have Ilya Shapiro from the Cato Institute, and you've got, I'm looking at the list now, you've got Alexander Hudson, who I go to church with, just to give her a shout out, Charles C.W. Cook, not Koch, Jonah Goldberg, let's see, I know I saw the Washington Post, George Will, I don't know how I forgot George Will's name. So it's the Larry Hogan's on there, who's politically a lot different than Andrew Langer for Institute, who's on there for the Institute for Liberty, which is a very libertarian institute. So yeah, it's got a wide range of people who broadly agree with the principles. And let's dive into those principles. I'll read them, and then, or at least a truncated version of them, and then why don't you expand on why you agree with it, why you think this is an important value for people to hold. Value number 1, we affirm the following principles. Number 1, liberty. Among Americans' most fundamental rights is the right to be free from the restriction of arbitrary force, a right that in turn derives from the inseparability of free will, from what it means to be human. Liberty is indivisible, and political freedom cannot long exist without economic freedom.
So as it said right there in that first sentence, this is among the most fundamental rights. And I think obviously without liberty, we have no other rights. We have no other foundation to operate on. So I think it's important for us to have that freedom from arbitrary force, to have freedom from overreaching government entities. And like it mentions at the end, economic freedom goes hand in hand with this. It's really just the foundation for everything else.
It's the foundation of how we got to where we are as a nation, and the less freedom and liberty that we have, the worse the experiment gets. Number 2, the pursuit of happiness. Most individuals are happiest in loving families and within stable and prosperous communities in which parents are free to engage in meaningful work and to raise and educate their children according to their values.
I absolutely love this principle. One, we're just starting to homeschool our children. And so I really appreciate the support for us to be able to make those choices as parents, as conservatives, to instill what we think is most important in raising our children, to help them be contributing members of society and the future leaders of our nation. So I really appreciate this principle. I think it's very important for us to have the ability to act how we deem most beneficial for ourselves, for our families, for our loved ones.
Yeah, I think it's important to support families. Obviously, community is a huge part of this show, and how we can build communities and where civil society is respected and used as the tool. Did an episode with Dan. I'm on my 6th interview today. Hold on, I'll just edit this part. Dan's slipping my mind for some reason. Yeah, Dan Johnson. Yeah, community is such an important point here. Dan Johnson was on recently talking about that, and we do a lot of that because civil society is incredibly important. You need issues that require a compassionate response are best done by private organizations and not profit-driven organizations or the government through coercion. So, number 3, the foundation of prosperity. The free enterprise system is the foundation of prosperity. Americans can only prosper in an economy in which they can afford the basics of everyday life, food, shelter, healthcare, and energy. A corrosive combination of government intervention and private cronyism is making these basics unaffordable to many Americans. We commit to reducing the cost of living through competitive markets, greater individual choice, and free trade with free people, while upholding the rule of law, freedom of contract, and freedom of association.
I absolutely love this as an entrepreneur, as somebody who fancies himself maybe just an entry-level economist. How I operate in my life is entirely based on maybe this principle. So for freedom of prosperity, we have the ability, like we said, to act in the manner most beneficial to ourselves financially. And I think through competitive markets, like it's mentioned here in this, that's the best way for us to achieve financial stability as a nation, as an individual, for us to be competitive with different countries, for private entities to be competitive in business. Ultimately, this is what makes the economy move. This is what makes finance move. This is what makes business grow and people succeed.
Yeah, when people wake up in the morning excited about their specialization, right? I'm an expert in podcasting. I don't know how to grow a turnip. I just put some mushrooms into some marinade, right? I don't know how to make teriyaki sauce, right? Mm-hmm. But somebody wakes up every day learning how to grow mushrooms or turnips or make the best teriyaki sauce there is, right? And that specialization where everybody gets to live out their passion and do meaningful work helps create this bed that allows this bed of, it's not just about the money, right? So I have critics in my life that are fans of socialism. They say, it's just all about the money with you guys. And that's not what it is. Prosperity is more than that. Prosperity is someone waking up and having the dignity of work that they love every single day to create income that they can then give back to their family, friends, community. And it's just the engine of what has made America special.
And you mentioned create income, but I think more specifically, this is individuals having the freedom and ability to create value, not only for themselves, but for society as a whole, and drive the nation, their communities forward.
Yes. Number 4, full faith and credit. The skyrocketing federal debt, which now exceeds the annual economic output of the United States, is an existential threat to the future prosperity, liberty, and happiness of Americans. We commit to building a constructive reform agenda that can restore America's fiscal sustainability, ensuring that future generations inherit a more prosperous and secure nation than the one we now inhabit.
I know most people that are going to be listening are going to feel the same way about this as I do. Every time I look at the national debt, there's another trillion added.
Yeah.
The spending just doesn't stop, and it's not sustainable. And fundamentally, I think most conservatives, libertarians, Republicans, wherever you're going to fall, view the spending and the government overreach in that as just totally unacceptable. And so fiscal responsibility and the ability for us to better manage our economic output is going to be what ultimately drives our credit forward in the future as a nation and then subsequently down to citizens.
Number 5, a nation of laws, not men. Equality under the law is a foundational principle of American liberty. Unfortunately, today this principle is under attack from those who believe that the rule of law does not apply to them. One manifestation of this problem is the explosion of unaccountable and unelected regulators who routinely exceed their statutory authority and abridge Americans' constitutional rights. The president should only nominate policymakers and judges who are committed to upholding these rights.
I 100% agree with this statement. I wrote an opinion piece a while back about the ATF ruling by executive fiat. They're not a lawmaking body, but they were instituting a pistol brace ban unconstitutionally without the consent of Congress. And instances like that, as well as instances where people feel there's a double standard in law and order that is different from maybe the ruling class and the middle class working man. And I feel like it's totally unacceptable. Ultimately, our politicians are elected representatives, and our president should be committed to nominating people that are going to support the Constitution in that manner and ensure that we're upholding that right and that freedom.
Yeah, rule of law is incredibly important and incredibly foundation to the American system of government. I like that they pointed out the fact that we have overreached the Constitution. And I would also, I think immediately your mind goes to Trump, right? He's obviously on his 5th trial today, literally. But he should be held to account if he's broken laws. But I think they've pointed out one aspect. There's a great book called 3 Felonies a Day that talks about how every person breaks 3 federal statutes a day. And the Byzantine nature, the reason that the great empire of Byzantine collapsed was because of what's now called Byzantinism, just the amount of regulations and rules and statutes, and everything got completely unpredictable and inflexible, and everybody was held to one standard, but other people were held to different standards, and that's where we're at today. I do think that people on the right sometimes have the right. Look, Donald Trump's a criminal, but hey, if we're going to hold him to this standard, let's hold everybody to that standard. And I agree. Let's lock up all the politicians. Number 6, Americans by choice. Immigration is a principal driver of American prosperity and achievement. America is exceptional because anyone from any corner of the earth can seek to live in America and become an American. Nearly all American citizens descend from someone who came here from somewhere else, and we must treat all citizens equally under the law. To this end, the United States, as a sovereign nation, has the right to secure its borders and design a rational immigration policy built on the rule of law that advances the interests and values of American citizens.
So this is probably one that I maybe disagree with more than any of the others. And it largely stems down to the securing of the borders type thing. I don't necessarily think that we should be having any border walls. I'm a supporter of open immigration and making it really easy for Americans to immigrate. And I think that this policy also touches on that, though. Immigration policy should be rational. It should be understandable. It shouldn't be such a convoluted process that it actually deters people from being able to immigrate here. Our nation was obviously built by immigrants, and I think that there's a lot of value in that diversity that we can bring in. For example, organizations that I've worked with and led, we typically are able to solve problems more efficiently if we have people with diverse backgrounds and different understandings that can contribute to the discourse and the problem solving. I'm a supporter of immigration. I think we should be doing things to make it easier and more navigatable.
Yeah, you worked in the most diverse organization in the country, the Army, right? In the military. You were in the Army, right?
Yes.
Okay. I'm with you. I think that this is, I'm to, I guess, if you want to say the left of this particular position. I completely agree with the first part. I think that immigration is a moral good, and Vivek Ramaswamy saying we need to deport naturalized citizens, it's just like a deal breaker for me with him.
Yeah.
Like, I think that's an insane policy that creates all this unpredictability that's intended to terrorize people. And it's just people who lied on their forms. You can go back on any form. Like, it's a basic principle of libertarianism is like, when the more rules the government designs, the more tricks that people who are motivated to use government force against you will actually use it. And this is one of those times where don't be naive, don't be deceived that when Stephen Miller and Donald Trump say that only people who lied on their application will get deported. You're going to wait 2 years and hear all these stories about people who didn't lie, but the government is saying they lied, and they're getting deported to a country where they never lived, had any attachment to. They're Americans. Yeah. And I can completely agree on that. I do agree. I think it's just crazy. We've gotten to a place in the last 10 years where you can no longer actually go through asylum the legal way. That's always the gotcha, that you're arguing with somebody who is pro-immigration controls, and they go, if they just came here legally, these people came here legally and they still got deported or still are on the other side of the border, we're not following the laws. And I think that's troubling for sure.
Absolutely.
Number 7, out of many, one. The best way to unify a large and diverse nation like the United States is to transfer as many public policy choices as possible to families and communities. Much of the discord in America today comes from the fact that too many decisions are made for us by centralized authorities. The Constitution of the United States is the best arrangement yet devised for granting government the just authority to fulfill its proper role, while restraining it from the concentration and abuse of power.
So, as a libertarian, I think the entry here to this paragraph, we need to decentralize and delegate authority to the lowest level. I view central planning and subsequently centralized decision-making as abhorrent, right? It's totally inefficient. You're having people that are not knowledgeable making these decisions about wide stretches of the economy and of public policy and of the lives of people that they have no knowledge of. So central planning is not the way to go. Centralized decision-making, not the way to go. Big supporter of delegated authority and making decisions at the lowest level. And I think ultimately the family unit should probably be the entity that has the most control over the family unit's life.
100%. Yeah. It is in extended families too. We'll be doing more on that, but yeah, when you engage in voluntary acts with other people and trade and commerce and not other things, but when you are engaged in protecting your community, when you're engaged in feeding your community, we have an episode coming up with Joe Garrison, who started this organization called the North Shadeland Alliance, where someone who worked at Subway that he knew, that he saw all the time, was murdered. And he got a group of citizens together and started this group just to put a police substation in their local area to curb crime. And then that led to solving the problem of the food desert in their area. And then that led to more political action to help grow their voice for this part of town that's always been disconnected. Here's a guy who just said, I'm going to do something about this with my fellow citizens. And next thing, he's getting all of this positive interaction with people that he would have never met, and they're interacting with each other, and they're feeling a sense of responsibility cross-culturally, cross-racially, cross-income to protect their community, to feed their community, to do things that are really important. The idea of pluralism is under attack on the right, when in reality, pluralism can be a strength when you're actually using civil society to solve these problems, as opposed to fighting for the gun of government to point it at the left's head. So I've always disagreed with the left as a policy strategy, a broadcast strategy. I just think it's too weak and anemic to actually fix the problems.
Definitely. I really like what you brought up, the example of taking that one action in the community has snowballed into this huge change for the community. Ultimately, people taking actions like that at a low level, whether it's your city, your town, your neighborhood even, you get a little bit more buy-in to the community as well. You're more invested in it. It gives you some ownership of your locale. And I think that's really important for Americans because it gives us that purpose and drive to keep bettering our situation.
Number 8, America's promissory note. Martin Luther King Jr. described the Constitution and Declaration of Independence as containing, quote, magnificent words, a promissory note to which every American was fall heir. Prior to 1964, however, slavery and segregation were enforced by state governments, and in many cases by the federal government. Many who descend from victims of this system now face economic and personal hurdles that are a direct legacy of this result. We commit to expanding opportunity for those who face challenges due to past government restrictions on individual and economic freedom. We adamantly oppose racial discrimination in all of its forms, either against or for any person or group of people.
I think that last two sentences there is very powerful. Ultimately, everyone, conservative, liberal, wherever you're going to fall in the spectrum, you have to agree that we need to oppose racial discrimination.
You would think.
Yeah, you would think. It's an abhorrent principle. It's inhumane. I have a hard time understanding how people can just be racist or discriminatory to begin with. Like I said before, with the immigration principle, I recognize that in the organizations I've worked with, like you mentioned in the military, there's a real value to getting this expertise from different people of different backgrounds. And just to judge somebody from a different racial background or ethnic background than you, I think is an abhorrent policy. So I'm glad this was included in the statement of principles. I think it's definitely something that anybody across a political spectrum should be able to agree with.
Yeah, I think as conservatives, the conservative movement and Republicans have obviously never done enough to have conversations or to take any steps towards racial reconciliation. And it's obviously hurt them with future generations. So I think if you're writing this statement, this is an important one to put in there and say, look, we're not your grandfather's GOP. But I also think it doesn't go far enough in starting the conversation. I think all of these are very careful, right? Because they want to build a broad coalition. So they're going to be as careful as possible. But I think just including race and racism and recognizing the problem that the right has in catering to racists, in protecting the feelings of racists, is a step in the right direction. Maybe not both feet, but I think it's a step for sure.
I think if nothing else, it's a foundation that builds a little bit of common ground. Like you noted, looking through the signers on the list, there's people from a large cross-section of backgrounds in politics here. And if we can create some common ground and create discourse around that, it gives us a platform to begin to move forward and solve problems.
Number 9 out of 10 here. We're almost to the end here. The shining city on a hill. American foreign policy must be judged by one criterion above all: its service to the just interest of the United States. Americans are safest and freest in a peaceful world led by the United States, in which other nations uphold individual liberty and the sovereignty of their neighbors.
So my thought when I read this statement is the best way for us as the United States to lead those other nations is by maximally upholding individual liberty and that fundamental liberty principle that we discussed in the first principle. So I view this policy this principle as a call to action for the United States to, one, get back to a basis of individual liberty, two, be laser focused on internal policy and internal defense, and then setting the example of that policy.
Yeah, it's really trying to negotiate a point of agreement, right? Because I'm non-interventionist. I agree with Jonah Goldberg on so much, but I listen to him talk about foreign policy, and we're on different planets a lot of the time. But I think if you can come together and say, look, does this serve the interests of the United States? Let's argue about that. Does it keep us safe and free where we are leaders? Are other nations upholding individual liberty and the sovereignty of their neighbors? I think I can look at it and go, Russia invaded the sovereignty of the Ukraine and doesn't have individual liberty at its heart. No matter what the issues are in Ukrainian politics, they are the victims in this particular. Now, what do we do about it? That's, I think, where it starts to fall apart, because I don't want to give any more money to Ukraine.
Sure.
And I'm sure a lot of people on this list would want to give more money to Ukraine, but at least we're trying to find a language where these two sides can start to find points of agreement. I think the critique of that from the more radical wing of the libertarian movement would be, okay, yeah, find points of agreement, but you're just going to get snowed. It's the valid MAGA argument of, why are we always trying to appeal to the media? Why are we always trying to negotiate certain stances with Hakeem Jeffries? Because eventually you just end up a Republican that agrees with Medicaid instead of wanting to advocate for getting rid of it, right? Which is the Michael Malice argument against the modern GOP, which is completely fair, right? You can be conciliatory to the point of losing your principles in some of it. So I think this one is just broad enough and just slippery enough that you and I can slide in there and go, okay, we'll at least be willing to agree to certain points of agreement to be a part of the conversation as a goodwill gesture. But I also don't think that non-interventionists are going to get from the people on this list the kind of conversation or points of agreement back that we'd like. So that's one of my hesitations with this particular piece.
Yeah, I think it's similar to the last one, where largely it's a foundation to find some common ground, and then you can have some discourse and
right.
move forward.
Number 10, freedom of conscience. Essential to a free society is the freedom to say and think what one believes to be true. Under the First and 14th Amendments to the Constitution, federal and state governments have a legal obligation to uphold and protect these freedoms. Private institutions have a moral obligation to do the same.
Personally, I take this one a step further than what is in the text, whether it's reading between the lines or just something I've made up in my own head. The freedom to say and think what you believe is fantastic. I think you take that a step further and you say this is the freedom to uphold your own morals and ethics. So I think it's crucial for the government to be able to uphold that principle for us. And I think that's something that conservatism across the board kind of can rally behind.
Yeah, I think freedom of speech, just as a basic principle, is so incredibly important and something that can unite everybody. It's one of the few things that between freedom conservatives and Larry Hogan and the MAGA right and QAnon, like everybody can begin. I like that they're trying to find these little points of agreement that, look, let's at least get the conversation started back in a direction of civility, as opposed to like carving each other up and trying to go at each other. I don't think anybody in the Trump camp is going to read this and go, you know what, it's time for civility. They think they're still on the ascendancy. They're going to have to lose one more time to be humbled before people with hubris can really start to have those conversations. And then most of them will not admit that they lost or that they did anything wrong or were ineffective. But overall, I agree with all of these principles. Anything that moves us in a direction of limited government and greater individual sovereignty from the government, I think is incredibly important.
Yeah, absolutely. I think largely these 10 principles, they do a really good job of bringing the conversation back to a root of conservatism. It's a refocusing lens for us to all get back onto the same page, reinitiate conversation, and start talking about things that are actually mattering in modern politics and discourse.
All right, Parker, shameless self-promotion time. If anybody wants to read these, you can check it out in the show notes. Leave your questions and comments. Go to the chrisspangle.com, go to the Substack, go to the page there and leave a comment. Start the conversation and chat with other folks. Shameless self-promotion time. Where can people follow you?
Like you said before, it's Parker_McCumber. That's spelled MCUMBER on Twitter.
That's right. Darn.
Not X.
All right, Parker, thanks so much for joining us.
Okay, thank you so much for having me.
And thank you so much for listening. We really do appreciate your time. We know it is valuable. You've got a lot of options, so we appreciate you listening. And if you got something out of it, if you want to share the word, that would be a great way to promote this show. Thank you so much for listening to The Chris Spangle Show.